What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up a meta report. That's right, we are doing a meta report, and in the meta report, we are going to be breaking down the meta share and the win rate of all the top decks in the game, showing what percentage of the tops they take up in each deck, as well as showing the percentage or the amount of tournaments each of these top decks won. Last week we had decks like Blaine, Weezin, Scolipede, and the Golem deck. We have removed these decks from the pie charts because they are just not doing good anymore. Their win rates and top-end rates have dropped significantly. In fact, in the 10 tournaments that I looked at for the data with 300 or more people, Golem and Blaine did not top at all. Scolipede only topped once, and every single one of those decks is under a 50% win rate or much lower. And with that being said, let's get into the meta share breakdown. So we are at the meta share part of the meta report, and as you can see, we have 7 cards representing each piece of the pie. We have Aerodactyl, Arcanine, Greninja, Celebi, Pikachu, Gyarados, and Mewtwo. Previously we had Misty for the Gyarados decks. Now we have Gyarados, because previously the Misty would represent all really major water decks, things like Starmie, Articuno, Vaporeon variants. However, we completely removed them. In fact, all these pieces of the pie only represent one specific deck. For Aerodactyl, after looking at the data, the best version of the deck, which is usually Aerodactyl, Marshadow, and Hitmonlee, sometimes do have things like Primeape, whether it's the old or new. However, the best version I found with the data is actually the Farfetch'd version. Same goes for the red portion. The Arcanine deck is the best Moltres build. It has the best win rate. It's actually winning the most tournaments, has the best top-end rate. It's the best performing Moltres deck, so we're only looking at that deck for the red portion. The Greninja deck is the new deck I keep talking about, the tech box. It's Druddigon and Greninja, not with Gyarados, but with things like Tauros and Mew EX. The Celebi portion represents specifically Celebi Superior and Executor EX, and specifically Executor EX at 2. It seems to be those are the best performing decks, so I only looked at those. Pikachu is Pikachu Zebstrika, the best version of the deck, and then Mewtwo Gardevoir is pretty much just Mewtwo Gardevoir, and then dependent can be something like a Pikachu EX or a Jinx more often than not. And so with that being said, let's get into the actual breakdown of the meta share. So the Aerodactyl, Marshadow, Hitmonlee with Farfetch'd specifically, no Primeape in here, represents about 2% of the meta in the 10 tournaments with 300 or more people that I looked at, which is kind of crazy. I mean, obviously, if you added the other Aerodactyl decks, it would probably go up to something like a 6%, but it's kind of on even with all the other Aerodactyl decks in regards to the meta share, but it seems to be the best version, so I'm surprised to still see it so low. The same goes for Arcanine. I didn't look at Charizard builds of Moltres builds. I only looked at Arcanine, Moltres, and Mew EX, and it's still very low. Listen, don't get me wrong. I don't think it's that great of a deck right now. However, it does have a very good or a decent enough win rate right now. It's still topping a lot, and it's still winning tournaments. So I guess we won't see it go up, but still 2% still seems very low, especially when you consider all the other Moltres builds are also around 2%. So if you add them all together, it's around 6%. But for that to be kind of on par with all the other Moltres decks in regards to the meta share is surprising, because it's clearly doing a lot better than the Charizard builds. And then the Greninja, which is super interesting. Greninja, Druddigon, Tauros, and Mew deck. This deck is on par with two very well-known decks. I find the Tech Box deck, that's what I'm calling it, is not very popular. Not a lot of people talk about it. I don't see a lot of people play it. However, it's being played just as often as Arcanine decks, so that is super interesting. And then these Celebi decks. Again, if we looked at all Celebi decks, the meta share would be higher. However, the Executor EX at 2 is only around 6%, which is kind of shocking to me because I honestly think that, and I've been saying it for a while, I think Executor EX is the best version of the deck, yet it doesn't seem to have a very, very high meta share. But the interesting thing here for Pikachu is even after you take out all the other variants of Pikachu and only look at Zebstrika, it's still a 10% meta share. That is still absolutely huge because there are other Pikachu decks being played. So when you take all the other Pikachu decks and you add them together, it's around like a 7%, which means this would probably be around a 17% total if we looked at all of them. But the Zebstrika, of course, is the most popular build right now because it's so strong into our next deck, the Gyarados deck. And Gyarados alone, no other water decks. We're not looking at Starmie EX and Articuno. We're not looking at Starmie EX and Greninja or Articuno and Greninja. No Vaporeon builds. We're not looking at off things like Blastoise decks. Just the Gyarados deck alone is 13%. This deck is super duper popular. And the only one that's more popular than it is, of course, Mewtwo, which is actually surprising because as we get into the rest of the data, you will see that the data is kind of low for Mewtwo compared to the other decks. However, it is still the most popular deck and represents the highest portion of the meta share in regards to the top decks in the game right now, which is Mewtwo EX. So now we are in the win rate portion of the video, and we are going to start with Mewtwo. We just finished with Mewtwo, saying that it's the highest representation of all the meta decks in the game right now at 19%. However, it still has the lowest win rate when we're looking at these decks specifically. It's only 49%. It's very close to 50%. And again, I said this last week because last week I was looking at a bunch of different decks, and Mewtwo was around like a 46, 47 at the tournaments I looked at. Again, I'm not looking overall. First of all, some tournaments, they have like 4 to 16 players. I didn't want to look at those. I want to look at tournaments with a lot of players to get as much data as possible. And so we're looking at 300 or more people in a tournament, and I looked at 10 total tournaments. So there was a lot of players and decks to look at. And Mewtwo, again, I guess it's because it's such a popular deck and so many people are playing it that it really comes down to who's playing the deck and also, of course, matchups. But to me, it still seems like one of the strongest decks. It's more often than not, has like the highest tournament wins. Last week it had 3 wins. This week that we looked at, it did not. However, still we do know how strong this deck is and how good it really is. Yet it has, as you can see, the lowest win rate on this wheel at 49%. And of course, this is all being rounded, so it's probably like a 49.23, but at the end of the day, it's 49% if we're being realistic about it. And then the next deck, which is also, in my opinion, probably top 2 decks with Mewtwo, is Pikachu EX at a 50% win rate. This deck wins more tournaments than any other deck I've ever seen, yet somehow only has around a 50% win rate. And of course, it could do with things like matchups, the player playing the deck, and things like in matchups playing things like fight index. If you get a lot of fight index, you might just completely get run over. And so some tournaments it does really good, and then some tournaments it does not so well. So we're at around a 50% win rate. And then when we get into the Aerodactyl Farfetch version of the deck, it's around a 50%. And as I said, I looked at the best version of each deck. Again, the Farfetch version, which means any other version is actually lower than 50%. So if you're thinking about like, well, hey, I want to know how well the Primeape Dex version, just know that it's less than a 50% win rate. And then as we get into the Gyarados, this also is around a 50% win rate. This deck still does really, really well. In fact, it actually does better than the rest of the decks that have a higher win rate than it, but it seems to have a better tournament winning record. Like, it wins more tournaments than the Arcanine, than the Celebi, and the Greninja Tech Box deck, but it has the lower win rate. So I don't know what that means. I guess it doesn't really matter about win rate sometimes. It really just comes down to probably the player playing the deck and the matchups. Of course, the data does matter. This does show us no matter what, these decks are still the best decks. And if you're going into tournaments, or maybe even ladder if you feel like it, if you want, this is where you want to use that data for, then these are probably the best decks to be using. And then we have the Arcanine at a 52% win rate. This was much higher, probably around a 3% or higher, better than all the other Moltres builds. And so that's why I specifically looked at this deck only. But again, the representation in the meta is only 2%, yet it has a 52% win rate. Now again, if it had, say, something like a 19% meta share like Mewtwo, perhaps its actual win rate would go down because there's more people playing it and possibly more chances to actually lose. And then the Greninja deck. This Greninja, Druddigon, Mew EX, and Tauros deck is a 52% win rate. That is fantastic. Again, I feel like this is a deck not a lot of people are talking about. They probably look at it, they think it's just some off meta whatever, and then they ignore it. But 52%, and it's getting tops and it's winning tournaments, which is not a lot, which is not what you can say about a lot of other decks. And then you have the Executor EX, Celebi EX, and Superior deck, a 52% win rate as well. That is super duper interesting, and I'm actually kind of happy to see it. And it kind of makes you think maybe if more people were playing Arcanine, this deck would have a lower win rate. But then again, you would also be running into a lot of water decks. But anyways, with that being said, let's get in to the top-in rate that each of these decks represent in the amount of tops that we looked at this week. So this is the top-ins portion of the video and of the 10 tournaments that we looked at with 300 or more people. There were a total of 256 tops altogether within the top within the 10 tournaments altogether. And as you can see, the Greninja, Druddigon, Tauros, and Mew EX decks represent 2% of those 256 tops. And then as we get into Aerodactyl, they represent 7% of the total 256 tops. And it's specifically the Aerodactyl Farfetch version. The Arcanine Moltres deck represents 10% of those tops, which is really, really good. It seems a lot more than I thought it would be, considering its meta share is only 2%. So even though it represents only 2% of the total meta, it represents 10% of the total tops that we looked at. And then as we look at Pikachu, Pikachu is only at about a 15%. However, even though it's not one of the top 3 in the game for top-in rates, at least this week or the week that I looked at, it does still have the highest finish rate. So this deck gets into the top, or is represented 15% of the 256 tops, but it still wins the majority of tournaments, and we'll get to that in a minute. As we get into the Gyarados decks, this is an 18% percentage of the 256 tops. The Celebi actually has even more at 19%, and of course Mewtwo, even though it has only a 49% win rate, the lowest amongst these 7 decks that we looked at, it has the highest Toppin rate, which is super duper insane. Like, it kind of makes no sense, but it still has the highest win rate. This deck is still really good, and this is why I keep saying it's most likely coming down to 2 things: either the player playing it or the matchup. But at the end of the day, regardless of the win rate, this is still one of the best decks in the game and has the highest representation of the 256 Toppins at 22%. And now we're going to get into the amount of tournaments each deck won. So these are the decks that won tournaments this week out of the 10 tournaments that I looked at, and as you can see, Arcanine is still winning tournaments. One of the other reasons why we only specifically looked at Arcanine builds: it has the best win rate, it has the best top rate, and it is still winning tournaments. And then as we get into Celebi, it won 2 tournaments this week, and I believe the 2 decks that won had 2 Executor EX. So again, another reason why we're only looking at decks that have Celebi Superior and 2 Executor EX. And then the Greninja Tech Box deck won a tournament, and was won with a bit of a different version of the deck. It actually decided to take out the Druddigons and add in a Marshadow and a Hitmonlee, add in more tech cards to this tech box kind of deck. Gyarados won 2 tournaments this week, and then Mewtwo only won 1, which is a big difference from last week where it won 3. In fact, this entire wheel or pie chart is very different than last week. Last week we looked at 7 decks, or 7 tournaments, I should say, and 3 were won by Mewtwo, 3 were won by Pikachu, and 1 was won by a Blastoise deck. And now the Pikachu is still at 3 tournaments this week out of 10. That is not much higher, but higher than all other decks. So Pikachu, again, only a 50% win rate, the Pikachu Zebstrika. However, Pikachu Zebstrika won 3 tournaments this week again. So sometimes it really doesn't matter, I guess, about the win rate. When you're that close in win rate, 49 to 52%, all within that range, you can probably just consider it all around a 50% win rate, and then it really comes down to how it closes out the tournament. And again, I'll say it as usual, it really does come down, especially in the tops, your matchups and who's playing the deck. If you're not playing the deck very well, you're probably not going to get into the top anyways. But then once you do get into the tops, you really kind of comes down to matchups and being the best player regardless of the deck. But anyways, with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in to this meta report. I hope you liked the video. Leave a comment in the comments section below. Like, subscribe, and share. And as always, keep cooking.